Hello and welcome to the CX Files for May 15th, 2025. My name's Mark Hillary and I'm in Sao Paulo, Brazil.
And I'm Peter Ryan on the road in Europe. Mark, joining you today from Budapest, one of the great capitals of Europe, one of the most historic cities that you could ever imagine. I've never been here before. It's stunning.
Well, that's fantastic. I've been there a few years ago, but it was for a CX conference. So I think I only had about a day to go looking around the city. But it's funny because this week I was talking to James Eyre at Teleperformance. He's just spent a whole week out there, but I think he was just enjoying it on vacation. So he didn't have to sort of run around a conference networking or anything like that.
Fantastic, fantastic. Well, Mark, I'm really excited for the interview that you've got teed up for today. Why don't you tell us a little bit about it?
Yeah, I talked to Martin Hill Wilson, who is well known in the CX community in the UK. He runs Brainfood Consulting, which is a CX strategy consulting and training outfit. And you know, Martin's been doing this for a long time. He's been publishing information and doing training on CX for many years. So he's sort of very well known in the industry. He always comes high up on all those charts of CX influencers. But he published something recently about AI use cases, and I think I commented on LinkedIn just saying, "Oh, you know, it looks like you've actually got some real use cases here rather than the normal nonsense we read about in the business media." And he said, "Yeah," and he sent me a report that he'd done, like a white paper, and there was actually some fantastic information in there. You know, he'd actually found great examples of where brands are doing customer related work using AI, but it's not the stuff that we always hear about, you know, the chatbots and the typical kind of customer facing stuff. And sort of a few examples is stuff like Telstra in Australia. You know, they're doing proactive outreach based on the way customers are behaving, and that's especially things like outages. So if there's an outage to a telco, you know, they can automatically do outreach to customers based on knowing where they are. Deutsche Bank is doing monitoring of unusual transactions. They can detect money laundering using AI. And there's even retailers like Walmart, Sephora, IKEA. You know, they're all doing personal shopping ideas and suggestions, all using AI. And this is all stuff that's like really happening. And there's real examples of brands using AI in this way to improve their relationship with customers. But you don't really sort of read about this in the mainstream media because everybody's kind of focused on the customer interaction.
Yeah, everybody's focused on the hype cycle around the customer interaction and how AI can supposedly revolutionize it. And, I'm really glad that you're having this chat with Martin today because one of the things that I've been advocating for some time is a rebalancing and a recalibration of the discussion around this technology. We need to talk about the use cases where AI is actually doing a good job, where it can be applied quickly, where it can drive efficiencies. And we're hearing more and more stories about AI in the background, on the back end, from an analytical standpoint to help people make the right decisions, to assist agents in what they're doing. I'm not saying that there is not a use case for AI on the front lines. We all know that there definitely are use cases in that regard, but where I'm seeing the rubber hitting the road, Mark, and where I think this discussion with Martin's going to go is the extent to which this technology is truly helping organizations and individuals in the back office on those on the background, shall we say, to run the company better, to make better decisions, to make decisions more efficiently. That's really where we're seeing this technology land. And I think the ability to source somebody like Martin, who's got such a background in this space and such a depth of knowledge along with yourself in this discussion, is going to be essential in helping, as I mentioned earlier, maybe recalibrate or redress the direction this is going. Because I can tell you right now, the level of frustration amongst buyers, the level of frustration amongst, whether it's on the enterprise side or the BPO side, around how to not just deploy the technology, but how best to procure it and where to use it is becoming palpable. There's a lot of I'm starting to sense pushback now against how AI has been oversold and the use cases that just quite frankly have not worked, and in many cases have cost a lot of organizations a significant amount of money, and they've lost some business because the technology just hasn't lived up to the hype cycle.
Yeah, and I think there's two things I would add to that. There's the Klarna example from last year, where
Yeah.
it was really trumpeted across the media that Klarna is now doing about three-quarters of all their customer interactions using AI. And it took them nearly a year to eventually row back from that. But eventually they said it's not actually as easy as all that to do this, so it's not that you can immediately just take away a vast number of customer interactions and automate them. And I think that that was a big point of correction, because everybody had taken that case study as an example of what you can do. And just also last week's podcast as well, where you heard Michael Aronovitz at VXI talking about the human touch and where is the value today. If you still want to drive revenue and value from your customer interactions, then have a conversation with them. Talk to them, ask them about what's their preferred type of hotel room, and don't just randomly get the bot to allocate them a random room. There's all this kind of stuff that just building the relationship and talking to the customer can actually then drive additional revenue. And that's the value of still having a human there. We know that we can automate stuff, but if you just automate everything, you're throwing away all that kind of interaction with the customer.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. Well, there's a lot to chew on here. So why don't we find out what Martin and yourself had to come up with during the course of your chat?
Great. Okay. Hi, Martin. The last time that we spoke was during the pandemic. So, although it feels like it was quite recently, it was actually 5 years ago. So, could you give us all an update quickly on Brain Food, and what are you doing with Brain Food Consulting?
Yes, Mark, thank you very much. And delighted to talk again. Can't believe it was 5 years. Back in the day, yes. So at the beginning and around of the pandemic, I was focused on the topic of managing the emotional component of interaction, particularly in a service context, particularly when it's live and even when it's self-serve. Obviously, outcomes matter, and getting better at making sure that we deliver first-time resolution matters, but the other thing is how you do it matters as well. And so I was trying to deal with the topic, which was some people do it wonderfully well, and there are always stars in those frontline teams, but that doesn't necessarily scale, and it's not necessarily embedded as a systemic capability. And, do you know, as a site manager, are you doing it all the time to a certain standard and a certain quality? So at that point, I launched a test and learn. I think we put about 50, 60 companies through that process. It was called Emotive CX for Customer Interaction. And that went really well. And actually was great timing given the pandemic turning up, people needing to address a sort of whole new segment really of customers, which has now blossomed into this vulnerability description of folk. And I think it also coincides nicely with just the pragmatism that some of the technology, particularly around sentiment management, emotion detection, voice of customer, starting to recognize different customers at scale, personalization, that's another version of that. I think it rang a bell. And since that point, I see others starting now to join the dots, starting to appreciate some of the basic psychology around of peak end rule ideas, and actually how do you recognize emotion, and how do you think about a good outcome in terms of a change of emotive state from a negative to a positive, taking some of the stuff that Colin was doing very well and he's continued to talk about. Then I got involved by accident, as usual, with AI. And the reason I got involved in AI was because I was, as usual, sitting on a stage doing chairing for the Engaged Customer conferences. And they kind of have one which is about customer engagement. It used to be about customer call centers, but it's a bit broader. And then one of their basic conferences. And, suddenly all the vendor presentations were instantly about generative AI. All the
Mm.
audience were kind of scratching their heads, interested, but mouthing words like children practice new words that they've heard in the schoolyard, but don't quite know what it all means. And I just looked at it and I thought, oh my goodness me, this is a train crash, or it's going to be very, very hyped up. And I think, and this has been said before, one of the interesting points I think about large language models is that voice has now become the interface between us and AI, and as such has popularized, democratized it, and brought it into everyone's attention. So
Mm.
we've now got a generation where it's not men in white coats doing weird things. It's really a living and breathing experience. So it occurred to me, and I'm even more clear now, 3 years on, that a foundation education for operational people who are non-technical is going to be really important, because if we're going to build organizations based on this tech, we really do need to make the right decisions about it. And we need to be informed about it. And we need to change the fact that most people have got some degree of imposter syndrome, because it just appeared, didn't it, 2, 3 years ago? No
Mm.
one
Yeah.
pretended to know about it. Why would you even know about it? And actually, funny enough, I'm just about to do a live version of what ended up as a couple of hours online course, and asking really simple questions to people like, what is an algorithm? They kind of know, but they didn't really sort of know. And then you
Mm.
say something like, well, do you know what a recipe is in regard to cooking? It has a similar function.
Mm.
And oh yeah, I get it. I get it. I get it. I get it. So what decided to do was to take a very practical approach to providing a common mindset, common language. I mean, 25% of Gen Z believe AI is conscious right now, with a further 50% believing it will be imminently.
Yeah. Yeah.
Now, what's interesting about that, if I'm in an organizational context, is simply if you think something's sentient, what kind of use cases are you going to apply it to?
Mm.
And you're probably going to apply it in a much too ambitious way. You're probably going to take failure, which isn't going to help you in terms of getting AI embedded in a practical, iterative, walk before you run way. And
Mm.
so I think organizations have got to take it on board that they need to provide and invest in some foundation education, uh, enable better collaboration between tech and ops, because the whole damned, the interesting thing is, I do think, as ever, in time, I'm really talking probably 10 years, we will see a different type of organizational model as a result of all of this. In the short term, it's all hype, but in the long term, it will turn out to be whatever, whatever. That's going to require something other than just phoning up technology and going, can you do your usual digital transformation? And the answer is no, because we've got no capacity, we've got no bandwidth. And I think what is interesting about LLMs, what will be interesting about agentic AI when it becomes less brittle, standardized, etc., is that it will be sort of like the no code, low code world, where to a degree, frontline teams with a certain amount of clarity can get on and build their own stuff. And so, in anticipation of all of that, I sort of doubled down with a friend called Brian Manasama, who was one of those ex-Gartner stars who did a lot of work on conversational AI and CX, and interestingly knows the hype cycle better than most,
Mm. Yeah.
and gets that really privileged position of both talking directly to tech, but also to very senior folk in the global business world. And we're saying to folk at the moment, listen, there's a kind of a cycle that keeps turning up around of a technology driven conversation where you very easily believe that it's simply plug and play. And you forget all of the transformational aspect, all of the business aspect, all of the human aspect of making those changes. And so we're sort of leading with this message of foundation education, something that everybody needs to be doing, and debunking a lot of the hysteria and excitement that's currently still washing around the market, and everyone pretending to know much less than they actually do in practice. So that's my latest shtick. It's called Brainfood Training. We've got a 2.5 hour course up there. How does it work? Underneath the bonnet, what are the issues thrown up? Because there's a ton of issues. And that was even before we had a certain, sort of set of geopolitical events taking place in terms of how personal data is being used and views about privacy and all of that stuff. And then North Starring it. I think that even before this latest generation turned up in call centers anyway, CCAS was getting so complicated, nobody knew what the heck was in the box. Really far too difficult. And I was experimenting about a year and a half ago with channel partners trying to help them simplify it. And I have discovered in that process that's telling a story of a day in the life of a customer, a frontline team, a site manager actually makes much, much more sense than the functions and features checklist stuff that everyone talks about, where you go, you lost me at omni-channel, orchestration, what the hell's that? You know, all of that stuff. But you just give somebody an experience and talk about it, how it actually works in practice. And everyone goes, oh, I get that. So again, you know, we developed that kind of 3-tiered module. What's it about? What are the challenges? What will it look like when we get there? And we're currently scaling that. So that's our thing at this point in time. And delighted that actually a lot of the tech vendors have also shown interest in that, because they benefit basically by having customers who feel more confident as opposed to a bit more timid, stuck in neutral, as Microsoft's latest report put. You know, there's obviously always the front end market, but the majority of people are stuck in neutral because they don't quite know, should I invest now? It's changing so quickly. What am I trying to do? I don't have a clear idea about it. I don't even know how to talk about it. So we've gone back a stage and say you'll probably get better momentum if you just get some foundation stuff in place. So in summary, that's what I've flipped into and I've been working on for the last couple of years.
Okay, great. Well, I mean, and that's kind of why we ended up talking this time, because I think I made a comment about some of the ongoing uses of AI in CX, and you actually just pinged me a report that you've been working on, and you mentioned that recently you've been gathering kind of like use cases, you know, so examples of AI creating customer value. And I guess that was going to become like a regular report, like you're planning to sort of continuously update that. I mean, what made you feel that you needed to start gathering this in one place then?
Yes. So again, for me, sort of been on brand almost in terms of being associated with making it simple, making it clear. I'm sure you have noticed that LinkedIn at the moment, and I'm not criticizing it, has become a place in which literally the latest story of where the birthing of agentic AI is happening. There's another diagram, there's another guru, and it ends up with sort of extraordinarily high, you know, 3,000 to 5,000 views with at least 200 odd comments, most of which, by the way, are, oh, wow, thank you. You know, rather like a religious revival meeting. And you look at some of the titles of the people saying that and go, my goodness me, we're in trouble. But nonetheless, it gets a lot of eyeballs and there's a tremendous amount of technically orientated fever. So that's very easy if you read that kind of stuff, or even indirectly become subjected to the headlines, to believe the technology is very powerful and very much out there. So I thought I'd do a counterpoint to that. And I thought what I would do is find the stuff that's actually been deployed in field, because that's really what it's about in terms of trusted capability. And so I thought, do you know what? I will do a regular thing to push it out to market so people can see something that they can connect to, something that they can go and research themselves, something they can go and internally take to somebody and say, look, there's something we've been thinking of and somebody else is doing that. Maybe we've got some more confidence now to do that. And I just thought that that's a barometer that I didn't think anybody else was doing quite yet. And I thought it would be nice and light, easy touch, and watch it as it sort of grows over time. And for my own sanity, it keeps my feet on the ground as well, and make sure that we can both see the potential, but we can also see the reality of where, you know, people have actually gotten to.
Yeah. Well, it's certainly very useful to actually focus on the actually delivered business cases. And this is something that, I mean, Peter, my co-host on this podcast, he's always texting me links to LinkedIn posts, which are just absolutely terrible. You know, it can be, you know, the lessons I learned about innovation from walking my dog and all these kind of things. But for some reason, they get a lot of attention. And AI, and especially agentic, is really the flavor of this quarter, isn't it? It's everyone's trying to work out where is it going. And I guess that what you're doing is saying that it is going to change all businesses. There is going to be a sort of fundamental evolutionary change to business, but it's not going to be driven by the IT department. It's like the end users are going to change how they're functioning. And I guess this goes against what we've seen in a lot of the CX environment, which is, oh, AI, that can improve chatbots, or AI, that can be an assistant for the contact center agent. So do you think that we've been too narrow in our thinking? We're thinking just of these very specific sort of business cases. And what you're really saying is, no, actually everything in your business will probably have to change.
It's a really interesting question that I'm going to answer that in two ways. So I have used some AI in order to be able to build that list. So I'm a big fan of Perplexity. I'm particularly a big fan of the deep research models that they've got. And you can switch on which model you want to use. You can switch on whether or not you want, to get some of the Reddit stuff, because I love the Reddit stuff, particularly if you can just pull out some of the most valuable stuff there. And I gave it a very full, and one thing I do know about prompting is that if you have a gap in your question, you're going to get a gap in your answer. So I no way was ever going to think, tell me about AI use cases in customer engagement. I'm going to get a pretty lousy answer for that. Mm-hmm. So I broke customer engagement down in a very precise way. I talked about everything from acquisition, marketing, onboarding, loyalty, churn, the whole 9 yards. I think I had 25 different descriptions right the way across, including vulnerability, including whatever you want like that. So it was very forensic in terms of me saying to them, go and do a thing on each of those. And by the way, it listed it all out as far as that was concerned. And then by the regions as well, I was equally prescriptive. So the weighting, such as it is, certainly isn't as a result of me just saying, tell me some more customer service stories. So that's one aspect of that. Now, whether or not that truly represents the distribution of AI going across the customer engaged life cycle, I'm not so sure it does, because I do know people are doing some great stuff in sales. I do know people are doing some great stuff in marketing. I do know, et cetera, as you do, I suspect. But what it does say is that I think that there has been an enormous PR push and focus upon, particularly also from the investor community, into the service component. And it has become a use case par excellence. It's often by the consultancies, I think, spoke about as a starting place that you can safely get up and running with. And I think most people have gravitated towards that. But if you go back a bit on foundation education and say that if there is one characteristic of AI family is to spot patterns in data, the opportunity to extract value from that is in no way constrained to a certain point where a customer simply wants to deal with a problem in terms of their relationship with a client, with a brand. It happens right from the very beginning, in terms of initially possibly me going onto social and starting to discover what other people are talking about, finding out what's available, right the way through to socializing it, choosing it, buying it, onboarding it, blah, 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 blah. And it goes all the way through. And certainly if I just reference my experience as a chair on events, listening to sales use cases, listening to marketing use cases, it's there. The marketing stack from a technology point of view is probably as imbued with LLM goodness as a service one. They might not yell about it quite so loudly, but if you, for example, if both of us was going to talk about personalization and that language of hyper personalization, that was entirely marketing originated, wasn't it?
Yeah.
And that, for me, has been a piece of hyperbole for at least a decade. And now you can see how you can take what we know about one individual and treat that level of what we know about you as a scalable, personalized set of offers in a very realistic way. That is now happening. Curiously, all of this, by the way, takes you back before you go forward. So most people find the quality of their data isn't good enough to play the game. So funnily enough, what you hear on these use cases is still POC, but mainly confined by the infrastructure and the quality of data, rather than the fact that the technology is not capable of doing those things.
Yeah. And what you mentioned there about a generic analysis of data and being able to find patterns, that leads to things like compliance. I mean, services like compliance must definitely be affected. I looked at your use cases, and it seems to crop up quite often in different businesses. Yeah.
I mean, one thing I learned when I was doing pin drop, which is fraud detection in contact centers on voice.
Mm-hmm.
And I wrote a couple of white papers for them, and I read lots of their stuff and got the benefit of talking to some of their gurus. One of my key takeaways is it's like a game of, I'll age myself. It's a Tom and Jerry cartoon between the goodies and the baddies, the bad agents and the good agents. And neither side ever ultimately wins. They just up their game. So, I could write, you could also do the same thing, scare the bejesus out of most of us by talking about the latest generation of AI-powered fraud in voice, in text. It is truly frightening, and the local authorities, again, have a heck of a job with dealing with that. But then you go and look at some of the financial organizations, they will be using exactly the same technology to up their game as well. And the thing is, it's rather like playing what's it called, noughts and crosses. You very quickly end up with a draw. It evens itself out again at the end of the day. But to the point, compliance now is moving from, I suppose, a generation of AI which was rule-based and possibly not entirely real-time, to being certainly real time, and also being much more adaptive to the patterns of fraud that are now possible. Let's put it that way around. And compliance, if you think about it, is one of those hallmarks of trust that anyone in the financial services space has got to get right. You cannot afford to be breached, around that. And so therefore, yeah, you're dead right. AI is blended in to the very latest. But it's probably the other thing as well to remember, of course, is that even before generative turned up, and it turned up because of all of this, what we've really witnessed in the last 10 years is the growth of cloud, the price point of cloud, the compute power that goes with that. And with that basic sandbox, I should say, has come bigger, better, more powerful algorithms, learning models. And then you get the breakthroughs, don't you? Like the transformer architectures and things like that, which occasionally turn up and then produce things like generative AI. But fundamentally, deep learning and all of that really clever stuff has just gotten much more powerful in the last 10 years. And those organizations can afford to invest in the very best technologies because they have to, because the guys who are, the bad actors in the world are also building their own and doing their own at the same time. So it's an arms race, and it continues to be an arms race. And I think compliance is just the front line of the ability to listen to every single transaction, spot if that pattern looks bad, looks good. And the balance is then between human intervention and an increasingly intelligent digital or automated intervention.
Yeah. I thought it was interesting also, there were some of the examples you gave were things that you might not sort of think about normally because they're in the background. It's like analyzing data, taking some decisions, reaching out proactively to customers based on something happening. And you had a good example with Telstra in Australia, where they were they were like mapping service outages. So, if there was a telecoms mast down or something like this, so the service would be affected in that area, they're proactively finding the customers in that area, reaching out to them, telling them that there might be a problem for the next couple of hours. And all that stuff can just kind of be processed in the background. But it prevents the need for customers to be calling and complaining, saying they have a problem. So you're sort of using that background process to deflect possible customer problems, which is great. I mean, that's a big bonus for the company, because at the end of the day, you're creating a much better experience.
But if you think about the importance of uptime, both as in the consumer world, but also in the B2B world, think about uptime in terms of railways, think about uptime in terms of even supply of materials. um, or the reliability of the core utilities. This is huge. Strategically, if you get that wrong, you've really lose thousands, millions of pounds. So interestingly, and I did some work with somebody who was building, digital twinning technology, working in some of the military stuff and also working on some of the build out of the railways that we were doing here at the time. And it's not actually terribly complicated if you say that all infrastructure either needs to be retrofitted with or will always now be fitted with simply sensors. And a sensor simply says my current state at this part of the infrastructure, and it just pings a data point. And you get billions and billions of data points, and you see patterns. And basically, a model which is tuned to spot the patterns will then be able to do all sorts of predictive through to preemptive analysis and whatever you want to do with that insight. And that's huge, and that's we benefit from our banks telling us you have just been subject to fraud and we have stopped it for you, which is one version of it, through to hopefully somebody, as you were just saying, anticipating if there was service outage here. It's a bit like a Mexican wave on a motorway, which is saying, why do Mexican waves exist? They're very strange entities. It's because there's a ripple effect as it eventually causes something to happen further downstream or upstream. And a service outage somewhere is going to put pressure somewhere else in the overall system. What will that be? Can we let somebody know about that? And I think that's the beginnings, by the way, of changing the whole nature of customer service, which has been purely after the events happened, can we clean up as fast as we can? Maybe we're beginning to work to a world where some of those things are caught in time, even prevented, or people have got some warning before they actually land, which will be a tremendously beneficial change for everybody.
Yeah. And I thought it was interesting that you were saying also that we've been talking about a lot of this for years, and just perhaps something like the data analysis or the raw power needed to analyze enough data in real time to do something like personalization. It's something that theoretically everyone's talked about, but then the reality is, you haven't got good enough data, or the data's not just not there at the right time. But I've seen examples that you've shared where you've got retailers like Walmart, Sephora, IKEA, even, and they're doing like shopping ideas, giving people ideas for what they might want to buy, pairing products with each other and stuff like that. And that requires some pretty hardcore background processing to know what that customer buys, what they like, when they need stuff. It's obviously something that we've talked about for years, this idea of the recommendation of products by retailers. But are we actually about to enter an era where they become actually quite useful?
Well, can you remember there were attempts to do one-off sneakers and one-off Levi jeans and one-off this and that, weren't they? Just as, they were, but they never sort of persisted and scaled. I do think so. Yeah. I think that certainly if we had a conversation with some of the medical geniuses around the place, they're starting to talk about medicine in that way, aren't they? The ability to know exactly what my individual body map is, if you want. And therefore what's needed as a result. And the more data we have about the things, the more we can do that sort of stuff. So I do think as a huge and therefore slightly banal point, welcome to the age of personalization, finally.
It's sort of a digital twin story, isn't it? Because we've seen this in, companies like Rolls-Royce, when they put they sell an engine to an airline, they will maintain a software version of that engine. So every minute that it's used, the sensors on the engine are replicated in software. And then, so instead of just saying, we'll do maintenance once a month, you can actually do maintenance whenever it needs it, and you get a warning of anything that might be going wrong. And it seems that, that was your point about just putting sensors in everything. That it seems like the way that we could do this, certainly with your own body, if you're wearing an Apple Watch, for example, you could be sharing that with your health provider, perhaps. and they could identify very specific medicine that you might need. I mean, I think that the problem is that the possibilities are endless. We could be talking about a rail network, we could be talking about a logistics network. There's just so many options there.
I think that again we're going to find how that develops, not slowed down by the technology, but slowed down by geopolitics, different attitudes towards privacy, the dangers that people find, the dangers that people find themselves in as a result of things being known about them. Which again, we can point to lots of places on the planet where that's currently true. And so you can quite easily see people taking a counter view to that stuff, which is actually, I'm going to go off grid as much as I can do because it's too dangerous to be on grid.
Yeah.
So I think in real terms, because those cultural aspects take a long time to mature to be far this, far that, or middle ground this or middle ground that. It's not going to be a universal thing at all. It has to exist within a trusted environment within certain parameters. So I think that would be the first point I'd make. And we're always going to have different approaches and attitudes towards that. Within that, the second thing I think is also the sense of agency that we have individually about controlling what you do and you don't know about me, and therefore my willingness and preparedness to actually give you my data. Most of the models, LLMs through to, bespoke models that have been built for healthcare have actually been built through the use of data in which there's been no explicit permission whatsoever. There's a current story about who are they called now? I've just written a post about them. They're an American company that do facial recognition. And they're distinguished by virtue of the fact that they've scraped somewhere between 3 to 6 billion images off of social and all sorts of places, mapped them together and have sold them back into law enforcement agencies. Now, that's clearly in many respects good from the point of view of law enforcement. Without getting too particular, right now that could be considered quite invidious in terms of how that could be used.
Yeah, yeah.
So that's the other side to it. But that all being said, yes, the world in which we are able to take data from across different points of our journey with an organization and produce truly personalized experiences is now very strong. Secondly, by the way, let's just move somewhere else with that conversation, which is I do think that data doesn't need barriers to it. And for example, the commonality of what we know about a customer as seen through the lens of sales, marketing, service, supply chain, whatever you want to call those things, should be increasingly common and available to the same approaches and the same types of algorithms, with the benefit of also then sharing that data in the same way. And I think that practice over the next few years will again start to erode in a very positive way some of the barriers between those teams and cause much more deliberate, conscious collaboration, and therefore start to form new types of organizational structure as a result as well.
Okay, that's great. Let's wrap up then, because the point you've just made at the end there is around organizational change. We're no longer just talking about which LLM are you going to use. It's actually how are you fundamentally going to change your business. But I think a lot of the hysteria and a lot of the discussion in the CX environment has always focused on the agents, the kind of interaction between the brand and the customer. Are you automating that process with the chatbot, or are you providing digital assistance to the agents so they can do a better job? Do you think then, from the discussion, I'm sure that you do, but I just wanted to know then, do you think that we are just misreading the opportunity here if the only thing we're really focusing on in the CX community is how do we change the agent customer relationship, and we should really be looking across the entire business?
Well, I'll give you one, which I think maybe we'll just finish on. Customer journey mapping. That's been around for a while, hasn't it? It's a much beloved notion. And if you actually do it, it's fun because you use Post-its and large bits of wall to do it.
Mm.
And as soon as somebody's had the terrible job of taking photographs and codifying it into a spreadsheet, it's out of date tomorrow.
Mm.
And it never captured the complexity because, gosh, how complex is it? And we had to spend a lot of time getting to where we got to. So the idea of it is fantastic, but it ends up as digital wallpaper because it's very difficult to operationally report on it and manage and update it and see the true level of complexity that exists.
Yeah.
I would have thought that's an excellent example, and I haven't seen it yet, but that's probably my ignorance rather than the fact it doesn't exist. I would have thought it's probably now able to do truly complex customer journey mapping and management in a way that was never possible before because of the pattern recognition that we've been discussing and we've been talking about. And actually, I would have thought that's going to be a filter you could bolt on to a CRM system, which is where all the differences that we know about customers, some of them anyway, sit, which you could then populate into that. And then you've got the complexities of those journeys. And you can see the deviation and just actually how do customers behave. It's sort of like Google Analytics for Mark 50 or whatever. Right. It's really trying to do some of that stuff. So yeah, I think the creative use of AI in all of those broader and possibly more strategic things. The other point is strategic planning, by the way. Nobody's really talked about that, but I'm very up for subtle forecasting. I mean, one of the great things, again, sorry to come back to contact centers. Well, actually, we can take anything. Warehouse planning. Let's do something different. The ability to do supply chain, scenario planning is absolutely transformed through AI. So you can do that at a corporate level for scenario planning, which applies to CX, so the whole level of what you can do to contain complexity is changed by virtue of AI.
Yeah. I mean, really, the way we should be thinking about it, I guess, is more like the introduction of the spreadsheet. The way that you could suddenly manipulate data and change variables and just the way that a manager just couldn't do that before the spreadsheet arrived. And it's kind of like that. There's a light bulb going on here in the way that we can analyze data and make decisions is completely changing.
We had quills and ink pots. We had pools of typists. And, we've reached another place where you can endlessly iterate and endlessly plan. And I do. And then actually, I think probably interesting generationally, there will be people coming close to retirement where actually they've been great leaders, great managers based on gut instinct rather than any evidence because it was never there in time or never complete enough.
Yeah.
But I would imagine increasingly generations of people coming through the system will now be very much more linked into and using data that is increasingly accurate and nuanced and easily adapted to particular needs in the moment. In other words, we will be doing evidence informed based decision making, and most of that decision making will probably be aided and constructed initially with AI anyway. So we really will be living at a different place.
All right, that's an excellent place to end. Thanks very much.
My pleasure.
Thanks for listening to the CX Files podcast. We really appreciate your feedback and suggestions. You can reach myself, Mark Hillary, or Peter Ryan via LinkedIn. Please also leave a rating or review on your favorite podcast provider, as that helps more people to find us. As always, we'd like to thank Chris Haig at Traction Media for the CX Files graphics. See you next week.